Okay, state park interpreter Robin Hazard, kayaker extraordinaire, you are live.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, hello from wherever you're visiting. Welcome to Morro Bay State Park. We are going to be doing a virtual kayak tour. So if you've never been kayaking, this is an excellent opportunity to see if it's something you might enjoy. It's a great way to enjoy and recreate in an ocean or aquatic environment. So like our wonderful moderator mentioned, my name is Robin Hazard. I'm a state park interpreter with California State Parks, and I am joined by my camera lady, Mariana Perez. So we are going to be exploring this beautiful Morro Bay State Park and its marine protected area. So let's go ahead and dive in to this marine protected area, or MPA for short. What is an MPA? Let us know if anybody's heard of an MPA before. Marine protected area, it's a long couple of words, so we like to shorten it by saying MPA. And what it means is it's a park. It's much like an underwater park. So for those of you who have visited a park before, a park on land, whether it's a California state park, like here at Morro Bay State Park, or maybe it's a national park, maybe it's a park down the street from your house, raise your hand or discuss with someone next to you if you like going to parks. I bet a lot of you, right? Parks are awesome. I love parks. I love parks so much that I work for a park. And parks are amazing because they're protected spaces, right? It's a protected space for you to enjoy the wildlife, for you to enjoy the wild vegetation and your natural environment. We've got some terns here diving in front of us. We've got lots of wildlife here. We've got another tern just up here. So parks are amazing, right? They're wild spaces that we get to enjoy. And for a long time, we didn't really have these wild protected spaces in the ocean. We have lots of different protected spaces on land that we all know and love. But in the ocean, there really wasn't that many until very, very recently. And if you think about it, our Earth is covered more so by ocean than it is land. So out of our entire Earth, 71% of it is covered by ocean. And yet there weren't really any protected spaces in our ocean, covering the majority of our Earth. But now we have these marine protected areas to protect our underwater worlds. And here at Morro Bay State Park, in Morro Bay, we have two marine protected areas. We have these spaces that are protected, that are set aside not only for us to recreate in or play. Recreate is just a fancy word for play, but also for the wildlife to survive and even thrive. Because if you think about it, this is their home. This is where they live. This is all that they know. This is where their food comes from. This is where they sleep at night or in the day if they're nocturnal animals. This is all that they have. So to be able to protect their home is a really big deal because it protects all of those animals. Does anybody know what kind of animals we have here at Morro Bay? Or has anybody been to Morro Bay before? If you've been to Morro Bay, you may be familiar with lots of different animals that live here, like marine mammals. Marine mammals are mammals just like us, but they live in the ocean. Marine meaning ocean. So these marine mammals live here in Morro Bay. So what's a couple examples of marine mammals? Well, here in Morro Bay, we have the California sea lion. We have the southern sea otter or the California sea otter. We have harbor seals. We have lots of different animals that call Morro Bay home. And same with birds. We have lots of different birds here in Morro Bay. We've got a brown pelican off in the distance. We've got some terns that are flying overhead and actually even diving. So this is their meal time. They're looking for something yummy to eat. We've got great blue herons, which is a big tall bird that actually looks kind of blue. We have egrets, which look kind of like great blue herons, except they're white and they're not as big. And we've got lots of cormorants. Cormorants are an amazing bird. These cormorants can dive really deep underwater. We've actually got some cormorants flying overhead here. And these cormorants, they can dive to up to 180 feet underwater. 180 feet underwater. These are birds, they fly in the air. But they can dive into the ocean and all the way down to 180 feet. I'll give you a little story. I'm a diver. I like to scuba dive. Raise your hand if you like to scuba dive. Who out there wants to be a scuba diver or already is a scuba diver? I love scuba diving because it takes me to other worlds. I can see all kinds of things underneath the ocean. When we're above the ocean, it's absolutely beautiful. And you can see all kinds of things, but when you dive into the ocean, you can see so much more. There's so much more going on underneath the waves. So one time I was diving and I saw a cormorant. I was swimming with a buddy because you always want to dive with a buddy to be safe. And I turned my head and I saw a bird flying underwater. It was amazing. It was so graceful, swimming just like it would be flying above water. I looked at my depth gauge to see just how deep I was, and I was at 80 feet. I was at 80 feet underwater, and this bird had dove all the way down to 80 feet where I was to go fishing, to go looking for some yummy food. So these cormorants are pretty cool. And just in front of us right here, you can see all of these trees. This is the heron rookery. So you may remember I mentioned the great blue heron earlier, which actually does look kind of blue. It's like a grayish blue color. They're a really tall bird with long, long legs, and they're very still. They hang out in the shallow water with their long legs, and they look down into the water looking for food. And because they're so still, this is a hunting mechanism. This is how they are able to sneak up on any food or invertebrates, which is what they like to eat. Invertebrates essentially is something that doesn't have a spine. So like a clam or anything like that. So here in this heron rookery, we have herons. And this is where they like to rest and roost. And you may be able to even see some of those little blobs up in the tops of the trees, and those are nests. But it's not just herons that like to roost here or rest here. It's also other kinds of birds, like the great egret and the snowy egret, which is a little bit smaller than a great egret, but they're also white, and they're a little bit fluffier. Their feathers are a little bit fluffier looking. And the cormorants. The cormorants also like to nest up here in the heron rookery. And this space is also protected. This is a naturally protected area for these birds to rest and eat and reproduce. So all those nests get to be filled with eggs and help to continue the life cycle of birds here in Morro Bay. We also have a lot of other types of things that call Morro Bay home, like plant life. This is known as eelgrass. And it may not look very interesting. It actually is really pretty if you look at it. It may not look super interesting, but this eelgrass is so important because it's the basis of the food web here in Morro Bay. A lot of the animals that eat this are eaten by other animals, and this eelgrass is so important. It helps to keep this ecosystem alive. So the really cool thing about marine protected areas is that we're not just protecting one species, we're protecting all of the species within this whole ecosystem. We're protecting the birds, we're protecting the marine mammals, we're protecting the plant life, we're also protecting the fish that call Morro Bay home. So we've got lots of different kinds of animals that call Morro Bay home. This place is full of wildlife. And these marine protected areas help to keep these animals safe and help to preserve their life cycle. It protects vulnerable species and ecosystems. Marine protected areas protect vulnerable species and ecosystems. How cool is that? And not only are we protecting these vulnerable ecosystems and species, but we're also conserving the biodiversity that calls Morro Bay home. So as some of you may know, it's Biodiversity Week, and every day we're celebrating a different part of the San Luis Obispo Coast District and the biodiversity that lives here. So what does biodiversity mean? It means that we have lots of different kinds of life here. If we were paddling around here and there was only one kind of species everywhere, there's only one kind of fish, maybe only one kind of bird, maybe only one kind of marine mammal, it would be pretty cool, but it would get kind of boring after a while. There wouldn't be a whole lot to see, and the life here wouldn't be able to thrive as much because they need diversity in order to thrive in this ecosystem. And here on the San Luis Obispo coast, we are a diversity hotspot, a biodiversity hotspot, which means that we've got so much life here. We've got so many different kinds of habitats, so many kinds of ecosystems. We've got woodland forests. We've got estuaries, which is where we are right now. Not only is this a marine protected area, but Morro Bay is also an estuary. Has anybody ever heard of an estuary before? Well, an estuary is a place where fresh water meets the salty sea. Fresh water from inland creeks or rivers or streams flow to meet the ocean, and it meets the salty sea. So here in Morro Bay, we have what's known as brackish water. This brackish water is what happens when you have fresh water meeting the salty water from the ocean, and it forms brackish water. And estuaries are actually one of the most productive ecosystems in the entire world. Another reason why all of the wildlife here love living here. They're able to have a lot of nutrients to help them grow big and strong. Another big reason why animals love it here so much is because if you look out towards the west, so this is towards the Pacific Ocean, you'll see a big stretch of land. And this is actually a very thin stretch of land. It stretches all the way down the south towards the southern end of the bay, all the way up almost to Morro Rock, which normally you would see, but it's pretty foggy today, so you're not able to see it that well. But this stretch of land is known as the Sand Spit. It's a peninsula that juts out towards Morro Rock, and the ocean actually filters in just near Morro Rock. On the other side of this sand spit, this thin stretch of land, is the Pacific Ocean. And if you listen very carefully, you is able to protect Morro Bay. It's able to keep this bay protected from the harsh winds and the harsh waves of the Pacific Ocean. And that's another reason why wildlife love Morro Bay so much, is because of these calm waters. You can see that Morro Bay's waters are nice and calm. We're able to sit here in our kayak and not get swept away by wind or current. It's a relaxing place for these animals that harbors a lot of nutrients and is a great spot to raise young, whether you're a fish, whether you're a harbor seal, whether you're a sea otter, or whether you're a sea bird. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. I know we've got a couple of viewers in the audience, one of them being Mrs. Sahib's 5th grade class. Shout out to Mrs. Sahib's 5th grade class for watching today. I hope that after this, all of you will be absolute experts on marine protected areas and estuaries and the importance of biodiversity. As we continue our tour through Morro Bay, you'll see just in front of us here, we have the Morro Bay Natural History Museum, which is currently closed at the moment. All of the trails surrounding this entire area are open though. Access to the beach. Like here in front of us, we have Windy Cove. This is a wonderful spot to go tide pooling and see lots of different shorebirds feasting away, especially at low tide. So at low tide, when the water's pushed away from the beach or the shore, the mud and the sand is exposed. And in that sand and in that mud, there's a lot of life that lives in there. Some of you may remember that word invertebrates that I mentioned earlier. Invertebrates are animals without a spine. And these animals love to live in the mud, underneath the mud. So if you come to Windy Cove and you see little tiny holes in the mud, this is their home. This is where they live. And lots of shorebirds know this. So they like to hang out when the tide is low and the shore is exposed, and they'll go to town. So the Morro Bay Natural History Museum sits on White Point. Windy Cove is in the center here. And on the other side of Windy Cove, we have Fairbanks Point. And this is a great spot to hang out. Usually the water is a little bit calmer here. A great place to kayak, especially if you're new to kayaking. If you are watching today, let us know either on Facebook or YouTube. Let us know where you're watching from. Let us know if you've been to Morro Bay before. So again, for those of you maybe just tuning in, it is Biodiversity Week. And every day we're checking out something different here on the San Luis Obispo coast because we are a biodiversity hotspot. We have lots of wildlife thriving here. And here at California State Parks and our partnering organizations, we do a lot to help protect and preserve these areas that contain a lot of biodiversity. Here on Morro Bay, we have a marine protected area, which again is like an underwater park. And marine protected areas are super cool because we're not just protecting one species, but we're protecting all of the species that live within this ecosystem. MPAs also help conserve biodiversity by protecting vulnerable species and vulnerable ecosystems. Has anybody ever heard of a keystone species before? Keystone species, what do you think that means? A keystone species is an organism or animal that's really, really important for the ecosystem that it lives in. There's one really important keystone species that lives here in Morro Bay. Does anybody know what that is? We mentioned it earlier, and I'll give you another hint. It's a marine mammal. If you're thinking the sea otter, you're right. The southern sea otter, or the California sea otter, is a keystone species. So how is it that this charismatic, fluffy animal is so important to the ecosystem that it lives in? Well, some of you may know what kelp is. And if I see some, I'll make sure to point it out. But kelp is an algae that lives underwater. And this algae, this kelp, when you have a lot of it, it's known as a kelp forest. And just like a forest on land, this kelp forest provides lots of homes for lots of different kinds of animals. Fish love living in the kelp forest. They use it to hide away from predators that are trying to eat them. And vertebrates like to live in the kelp forest. There's lots of different kinds of animals that call a kelp forest home. So when you see a big kelp forest, it's usually an indicator. This right here is kelp. It's usually an indicator that it's a really healthy ecosystem because all of these animals are able to hide away and have a place to call home. They're able to have shelter. Well, there's a certain animal called the sea urchin that likes to eat kelp. This sea urchin looks like a pincushion, a purple pincushion, sometimes it's red. And the sea urchin gobbles up all of the kelp. This right here is kelp. And when you have a lot of it, it looks like a big forest. These look like the leaves. These are actually known as blades. And these little air bubbles, these air pockets, they're filled with air, and they actually serve a really important purpose. They make those leaves float up closer to the surface of the water, exposing these leaves or blades to the sun, because that's how they get their food. Just like plants, they need sunlight in order to grow and thrive. So a lot of plants call a kelp forest home. But if these sea urchins, these purple and red pincushions, are eating all of the kelp, all of those plants and animals that live within a kelp forest, they're going to struggle, aren't they? They're going to have difficulty thriving without a house, without a home, without shelter. But comes to the rescue our southern sea otter. The southern sea otter, the keystone species I mentioned earlier, loves to eat sea urchins. And they gobble them up. These sea urchins, they have a lot of calories that they can give to the sea otter. It's like a superfood for them. Gives them lots of energy to go about their day. And these sea otters, they need a lot of energy, so they eat a lot of sea urchins. And when those sea urchins get eaten, the kelp forest is saved. So these sea otters are very, very important to the health of this ecosystem and to the health of other kelp forest ecosystems. Oh yeah, what's our question? Yes, there are different kinds of kelp. There is bull kelp, which we actually have one just ahead of us near this western goal. There's bull kelp, there's the giant kelp. There's also one that looks like a feather boa, like something you'd wrap around your neck. There's lots of different kinds of kelp. Good question. And again, for those of you just tuning in, I encourage questions. So if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer. So these sea otters, they help protect these kelp forests. They help protect the animals that live in the kelp forest. And so we want to do our part to help protect keystone species just like the southern sea otter. And a good way for humans to help protect animals, protect all wild animals, is by respecting their space. Here is that bull kelp that I mentioned. It's a pretty impressive, large looking piece of kelp. You can see that it's nice and slimy. And fun fact, this sticky, slimy stuff that you see on the algae, this is actually a chemical or a component, an ingredient that exists in a lot of things that we use. For example, who brushed their teeth this morning? I understand it's still kind of early, so there's no judgment, but if you brushed your teeth this morning, in our toothpaste, there is an ingredient that comes from kelp. So again, it's kind of early. Some of you may not have brushed your teeth this morning, but raise your hand if you like ice cream. Who likes ice cream? I love ice cream. And in ice cream, we also have that same ingredient that comes from kelp, that comes from that algae. So a lot of resources come from the ocean. Fish, we know, comes from the ocean. So for those of us that eat fish, we know that we are dependent upon the ocean. But other resources also come from the ocean. Sometimes in things that we use every single day, hopefully like toothpaste. So protecting these keystone species like the sea otter is really important. So how can we protect them? We talked about respecting their space, but what's a good way to tell that we're getting too close to an animal? And not just a sea otter, but any animal, any wild animal. Does anybody know? How can you tell if you're getting too close to wildlife? A really good indicator, a really good way to tell if you're too close to wildlife is if they're looking at you. So if you're kayaking out in Morro Bay and you're near the sea lion dock, or you're near a raft of sea otters, a raft of sea otters is a group of sea otters. So just like a group of dolphins would be known as a pod, a group of wolves would be known as a pack, a group of sea otters is known as a raft. So if you're near, oh yeah, another question. Very good question. You can fish in Morro Bay. So there's actually, as I mentioned earlier, two different kinds of marine protected areas. And there's different flavors to marine protected areas. You can think of them as different flavors. One is known as a state marine reserve, which is in the back bay, all the way at the very end where it gets really shallow, where those inland creeks come in. This is known as the State Marine Reserve. And what that means is there's no take whatsoever. There's no take of cultural artifacts, no take of shells, no take of any animals or plants of any kind. But there's other marine protected areas, or MPAs, that you can take things. And so the one that we're actually in right now is known as the State Marine Recreation Management Area, or SMRMA for short. And in a SMRMA, you're able to take certain species. So depending on the area that you're at, you can take some of one species but less of another. So if you have a lot of one kind of fish but not a whole lot of another kind of fish, you're able to take what you can of the fish that's thriving, maybe, and not of the one that needs help rehabilitating or growing in numbers. Very good question. Another good thing to note is that not all marine protected areas are the same. And there's a lot of different kinds of marine protected areas. For those of us who live in California, raise your hand or pat yourself on the back if you're a resident of California, because we are super lucky here. We have the largest network of marine protected areas in the entire world. So all the way from the northern border of California, where we border Oregon, all the way down south to where we border Mexico, we have 124 marine protected areas. Again, that makes up the largest network of marine protected areas in the world. And if you think about that coastline, that giant California coastline, it's all very different. For those of you who are from San Diego or live or have been to San Diego, you know that maybe you've got some sandy beaches, there's an estuary down there. And for those of you who've been to Northern California, there's a very different ecosystem. It's a lot colder there. You have rockier shores. And so not all marine protected areas are the same because there's different animals living in different MPAs. So being aware of what's allowed in your MPA is something to look into. So if you are wanting to fish, making sure to do a little bit of research and just see what you're able to do. And not only will that research help you understand what you're able to fish and what you're not able to fish, but it'll also be a really fun way to get to know the area, get to know what's around you, get to know what lives in that area of ocean. Very good question. So again, a really good way to help protect the animals is by giving them space. And a good way to know when they need space is if they're looking at you. If an animal is looking at you, you're too close. And they're oftentimes spending energy they can't afford because they have to live out here. And it can be a rough life. They're often having to look for food. They're trying to rest and save their energy. And if they're bothered by someone paddling right through while they're sleeping, this can stress them out and this can cause energy that they can't afford to lose. So paying attention and being mindful that you're in someone else's home. So imagine right where you're sitting, if you're sitting at home, maybe in your living room, maybe in your bedroom, maybe in your kitchen, if someone you didn't know walked right through the room, that would be pretty startling, wouldn't it? It would probably put you on alert and would make you feel a little uncomfortable. So remembering that when we go to these natural spaces, we're in someone else's home and we need to make sure to respect that home. So again, if an animal is looking at you, you're too close and just back up a little bit. And if you are kayaking, a good rule of thumb is to stay 5 kayak lengths away. So you can see the length of my kayak here. And if there was an animal about 5 kayak lengths away, that would be perfect. I wouldn't hopefully be bothering them. Another good way to kayak or stand up paddle near wildlife is to make sure that you're parallel to them. So if the animal is out in that direction, then I don't seem like an intruder. I'm not pointing right at them. But if I'm heading right towards an animal directly in front of me and my kayak is pointing at them, I might want to pivot a little bit, just like this, showing them that I'm not a threat and I don't mean to harm them. So again, if you're visiting and watching and joining this kayaking tour, let us know where you're visiting from. Let us know if you've visited Morro Bay State Park before or if you've kayaked on Morro Bay. Maybe talk about what kinds of animals you've seen, because remember, this is a biodiversity hotspot. And oftentimes, I'm here a lot, but oftentimes I'll see an animal I've never seen before because there's so much wildlife here. Kayaking is super peaceful, really relaxing. Some people can get intimidated by kayaking, but if you pay attention to the tides, whether it's a high tide or a low tide, and pay attention to the weather too. So if it's really windy, I wouldn't come out here and kayak, but it's a nice calm day. You can see the water has a little bit of a ripple in it, but it looks like glass almost. It's a really nice day to kayak. What's that? Very cool. They are an awesome partner to check into. We mentioned sea otters earlier. And if you like sea otters, if you like wildlife, they are a good one to check out. They have a lot of neat pictures and a lot of good tips on how to recreate responsibly near sea otters. There's a lot of fun facts on their website. And for those of you also interested in sea otters, for Biodiversity Week, we are doing something different every single day. And coming up on Thursday, we will be having Sea Otter Savvy giving us a little glimpse into sea otters, a fact versus fiction. And you're able to ask questions and get all of your sea otter comments, concerns, and questions out there. Heather Barrett will be joining us on Thursday, and she'll be able to answer all of your questions that you've got. The myths you've heard about sea otters. And also in about 2 weeks, it's Sea Otter Awareness Week. And Sea Otter Awareness Week will be very much like Biodiversity Week here on the San Luis Obispo coast, where it will be all virtual and every day will be something different. So make sure to tune into that and learn all about these California sea otters, how they adapt to this environment, how they're an important keystone species, and they're important for the ecosystem. So we mentioned earlier when we looked at the kelp, that kelp is creates an ingredient in a lot of the things that we use daily, like toothpaste and ice cream. And for those of us that eat fish, we also know that a lot of our resources come from the ocean. But there's one really big thing that's really important for all of us that we use every single second that comes from the ocean. Does anybody know what that is? I'll give you a second to think about it. Raise your hand if you're breathing right now. Hopefully all of you are raising your hands because we need air to breathe, right? And we have the ocean to thank for that, because for every 2 breaths that we take, 1 of them comes from the ocean. So if nobody has any further questions, I have one last exercise. And we might actually show you more rock because you're able to see it. But we'll go ahead and take 2 deep breaths and thank the ocean for 1. Are you guys ready? All right, deep inhale and exhale. Inhale And exhale. And now say thank you, ocean. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Mariana, my camera lady, Robin, our moderator, and myself for a beautiful day in Morro Bay. And you can actually see the rock today, or at the moment. Earlier you weren't able to see it, but now you can see beautiful Morro Rock. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us here and joining the wildlife, and learning to recreate responsibly around wildlife is really important, especially if you enjoy playing in these spaces and learning about these animals. Thanks so much for joining this beautiful biodiversity hotspot, and we'll see you all tomorrow on Estero Bluffs with our environmental scientist at California State Park, environmental scientist Jody Isaacs. She's going to be talking about black oyster catchers, which is a really cool bird with a big orange beak and pink legs. And we'll be learning about the biodiversity that exists at Estero Bluffs State Park. So thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Bye.